So this is the last of our course, the last lecture of our course, when I finally get to Hasidism proper, which, as I told you before, was my starting point. I went backwards, as it were. I began with Hasidism, and now I'm concluding with Hasidism. And you will have already heard from me a few things here and there in connection with the other things we were talking, especially last week. And today I'll try to offer you a picture. It's as much about the historiography of Hasidism as it is about Hasidism. Because, you know, I don't remember whether I told you that, but I'm telling you it again if I have. And that is how I first became interested in the question of the position of women in Hasidism. You know, I had by that time been working on Hasidic texts for about 20 years. You know, I had done my doctorate, I was already teaching at University College. I got a fellowship to Harvard Divinity School, which was designed especially for, it is called the Women in Religion program. And they bring every year four, I think it was to be, maybe sometimes 5, scholars from all over the world. And it was designed to stimulate research into the relationship of women to religion in all over the world. I confess that I applied to it very cynically. I didn't have the slightest interest in the position of women in Judaism, in anything. I just thought, you know, and I wasn't even thinking that I would apply, except that I was in Norwich, where my husband was living at the University of East Anglia, and a good friend of mine from Israel, who is professor of Jewish mysticism, came to visit with her family. They were on sabbatical in Oxford, and they came to visit us in Norwich. And I showed her this letter. I got a letter that Harvard Divinity School was circulating to people to encourage them to apply. At that time, the program was fairly new. It had been 5 or 6 years only in existence. Now it's been going on for decades. So Rachel saw it and said, apply. I said, why should I apply? I have nothing to do with women. Why should I? I'm not interested in women. And I even got slightly offended. I thought, well, they sent it to me because I'm a woman. Is it because I'm a woman I have to be interested in women in religion? You know. And anyway, what's there to say? She said, oh, you know, cook something. You know, you can do it. So I took her advice and I wrote an application. And out of my thumb, as they say in Yiddish, you know, I squeezed out a project, you know, which was designed to examine, at that time nobody was doing any work of this kind, to examine the relationship between the Kabbalistic development of the notion of a female aspect of the Godhead, the Shekhinah, and the position of women in the society in which this idea emerged, you know. So, is there any relationship between suddenly detecting a very powerful female part of God and how you treat your wife, how the community treats the women within? So I wrote this project, and I didn't think more about it. And 6 months later, however, I get a letter saying I've been elected. So suddenly there was, you know, my husband had to take leave of absence. He came to Harvard as a spouse, which was funny because the first week we were there, he was invited to the spouses club. You know, they had Harvard looks after people very well, so they have a special thing for the spouses. It was 95%, 99% women, all the wives, and they were doing things about how to make tea and, you know, how to bake certain kind of Boston things. and there I was. So once I was there, I was stuck. I had to do something about it. And actually, it was a very interesting time. This was the late 80s. A very interesting time at Harvard for the field of women's studies generally. You know, in England, it hardly existed at all. There wasn't a single university that taught a course on women or degree in gender studies, which later on proliferated. Nothing. Harvard, one of the most conservative and most prestigious bastions of academic life in the United States, was going mad with it. I felt like I had gone into a crazy world, you know, in which things were happening that I couldn't imagine. There were people in the divinity school there were feminist theologians, some of them very famous, Mary Daly, anyway, who had rules that no men are allowed into their classes. There were seminars on witchcraft for women. They were sitting on the grass and learning about witchcraft. There were transgender students. I had one, and at that time I was very inexperienced in and this was frightening. A figure, a very tall figure with a very deep voice, dressed as a woman, and I didn't know how to deal with it and what to call it. Nowadays, of course, we take it for granted. It's part of the landscape. And this was cherished, and encouraged, and there was the beginning of the organization on campus of gays and lesbians and transgender. None of it was conceivable in England at that time. So, almost in spite of myself, I started reading some of the literature that was coming out and going to other people's classes and learning. And I devised a course for the first time and started reading about women in Judaism and discovering all kinds of strange things. But the strangest of them, of all for me, was the position that women occupied in the kind of literature that was not academic. Because in academic scholarship on Hasidism, not a word, nothing. Nobody asked any questions, never raised the issue. But there was a kind of popular literature, and some of it I was introduced to, not by colleagues, academics, but by the Hillel Rav, the very wonderful Polish Jew who I became a great friend and who was a very well informed and knowledgeable and intellectually alive person, who was a Holocaust survivor, who had stories to tell, and he had a huge library at home. And he was lending me books in Yiddish, published in Warsaw in the 1930s, some in Yiddish that were published in Buenos Aires in the 1960s, and some Hebrew magazines from the 20s and 30s, from various places in Central Europe, that had articles about great Hasidic women leaders. And I couldn't believe my eyes. Where is this coming from? I'd never seen anything of the kind anywhere in the Hasidic literature that I was an expert in, supposedly, by that time, 20 years behind me. And so I started to dig deeper. And fortunately, Harvard Library is wonderful, very well stocked in all languages. And I realized from an incidental reference in one of these popular journalistic, some of them fictional accounts about great Hasidic female leaders, a reference to a scholar, a semi-scholar, whose books I had on my shelves, a man called Shmuel Abba Horodetsky. And I actually happened to know of him and to have some of his books with his dedication to my grandfather, because he came from Berdichev in the Ukraine, where my grandfather came from, to Palestine. And they were friends, and he ended his life in Tel Aviv. He immigrated to Israel, to Palestine in 1939, at the very last minute from Berlin, where he had been studying for some years, having left the Ukraine, where he was born, in 1907, after a wave of pogroms, of the early 20th century, in the first decade of the 20th century. So he left first to Switzerland, finally to Berlin, got a doctorate, became sort of a scholar, without ever having an academic position. And when he came to, even before he came to Palestine, he started publishing in Palestine. And his books, which were, first of all, and I have it on my shelves to this day, with my grandfather's priestly ex-libris that I'm very fond of, because Rapoports are priests, if you with a dedication to my grandfather, he wrote a 4-volume history of Hasidism, which was a kind of, I treat it nowadays as a Hasidic source rather than a scholarly work, because it is based on what he knew from childhood, from his family, traditions. It is written in an organized fashion, like a history book, but there are not many footnotes, and a lot of it is embellished with stories and so on. And moreover, the great scholar of academic mysticism and Hasidism. I mean, the man I regarded as the teacher of my generation, and that is Gershom Scholem, had written some nasty reviews about the kind of scholarship that was being published by Hordet. He dismissed him as a dilettante, as not a historian. So I was kind of trained to treat it with, with disrespect. But I had the books. He also wrote an autobiography, which is extremely interesting, became very interesting for me afterwards, and also an interesting book which interprets the whole of Jewish civilization, from biblical to contemporary, in the framework of two categories, which he called the Judaism of intellect and the Judaism of emotion, Yahadut HaSechel v'Yahadut HaRegesh. And this too became very useful for me eventually in understanding what he was doing. So I happened to know his books, I had them on my shelf, didn't treat them seriously. And in one incidental reference, in one of these semi-fictional, journalistic, publicistic, do you have the word in Spanish too? Publications where I read about all these great women who were great Hasidic leaders in their day, in the distant past, without any chronological anchors or geographical specific anchors, but nevertheless, there was a reference to something that Horodetsky published in 1909. And I started looking for it, and it turned out to be an article. He published a short article, about 3.5 pages, in a Russian language, scholarly journal, being published in Russia, edited by the great historian Simon Dubnov, a great historian of East European Jewry, an article entitled The Ludmir Moid, a Yiddish title, and then the translation of that into Russian, Ludmirskaya Dieva. So an article in which he reports traditions that he says he heard by traveling around in the region of the Ukraine from which he came, the southern Ukraine. He was born and brought up there. Not only that, he is himself descended directly from one of the great Hasidic leaders of that region, Mordechai of Chernobyl. And Chernobyl is the name of a Hasidic dynasty of leaders that was very powerful in the Ukraine. Already in the late 18th century and in the early part of the 19th century, they split, but spread. Chernobyl is a big Hasidic leader, lots of Hasidic leaders associated, and he was a great-grandson, I think, or a grandson of the founder, Mordechai of Chernobyl. And his family was connected with the Chernobyl Hasid. So he was brought up in a Hasidic environment of the Chernobyl tradition in the Ukraine, and he's now traveling. And he's traveling because at this time, in the first decade of the 20th century, and into the second, until just before the First World War, and to a certain extent, even at the end, in the last decades of the 19th century, there was already a growing sense among Jewish intellectuals in Eastern Europe that the past, the historic past of the shtetl, as it is called, the typical Jewish provincial town, sometimes very small, in which the Jews constitute demographically the majority, the absolute majority of the population, where they're concentrated in certain types of occupations, and basically they govern their own lives. They have communal institutions that, although the Russian government abolished the legal status of these institutions at the beginning of the 19th century, they continue. They no longer have the kind of stamp of recognition by the Russian authorities, but they continue to function. The community has its kahal, which is the governing body made out of wealthy members and the rabbis, and they have the institutions, they have the Pikasim, they have many association fraternities of different professions, a bit like the medieval guilds, so there's the society of the shoemakers and the society of the tailors, and they each have their own places to pray and lots of Hasidim in this area. Mm-hmm. So there was a growing sense among Jewish intellectuals that this framework of Jewish life that had gone on for a very long time, it started in Poland already in the 16th, 17th century, 18th century, became part of Russia after the partitions of Poland in the beginning of the 19th century. is disappearing very rapidly. There was now the train, people were moving about, there was a lot of internal migration within the Russian Empire. Urbanization, a lot of Jews were drawn by economic life to the big cities. They were settling in places where there were no Jews before in the past. So the whole structure was fading away, and there was a kind of a romantic desire to capture it before there's nothing left. So we have several expeditions of people who are amateur ethnographers. They go around and record. Thank God they did, because thanks to them, we have some records of the music. You know, Ansky, the man who wrote the very famous Yiddish play, the Dibuk, I don't know if it exists in Spanish, about possession. Dibuk means a possessing spirit. And it is a play that has international reputation. It is very magical. Every now and then it is revived in Israel and also in other languages. I have seen it in London at least 3 times, you know, by characters who have nothing to do with Judaism. They've asked me to come and check how they pronounce certain Jewish words that are in it. So it is, this man is famous because of this play, but quite apart from that, he conducted and raised a lot of money and got a whole team of people to go around, travel in these shtetls that were dying. You know, the numbers of, you know, the population was declining, people were leaving, to capture what they could. So they took photographs, they recorded the music, and all this is preserved. It's in the Kiev Vernadsky Library of Jewish klezmers, of Jewish musicians. They walked around talking to people and recording the stories that they had to tell. And Horodetzky did this on his own, informally, traveling from place to place, recording. And this article is the product of what he heard. And he says at the beginning, this is on the basis of stories that were told to me by old people in this particular place. Okay, so I want to share with you the discovery that was the product of quite a lot of work, that ultimately all these later 1920s, 1930s, 40s, 60s accounts about great Hasidic female leaders, if you strip them off the fictional elements that are very obvious, all go back to Horodetzky. That is the core of information we have. Nothing else. I mean, I can vouch for it. Each author develops, you know, as his imagination allows him, but the core about the early phenomenon, you know, because this tradition, as he married, it hasn't got precise dates, but we get the impression that it belongs in the beginning of the 19th century. So this is within, say, 50 years of the beginning of Hasidism. Some of the late publications that talk about these great Hasidic women leaders are already dealing with phenomena that belong to nearer their own times, where you can rely on their own memory, the end of the 19th century. So there are a few women who are listed, and they are, without exception, the mothers, as Mariana raised the question last week, I think, very rightly, they are all women who are family connections to the great male Hasidic leaders. The sisters, the daughters-in-law, the widows. In only one case did I find a wife, and even that is uncertain. It's interesting, not the wife, the widow, the dowager Rebbetzin. The title in Yiddish of the wife of a great Hasidic leader, who is called Rebbe, is Rebbetzin. That's a feminine suffix for in Yiddish. So the dowager Rebbetzin, you know, like the dowager queen, the mother of a king when her son succeeds, was described as a woman who has, and there were several of them, from the end of the 19th century. One of them even, I remember, they described her funeral in the beginning of the 20th century, and this was somebody talking from memory. The streets of Warsaw were full of mourners who went after her coffin as she was led to burial. So that is beyond doubt based on observation. But the stories that are tracing this back to the beginning of Hasidism, or to the very early, the formative period of Hasidism, we have no evidence, and there's a lot of kind of florid development of the story in fiction. There's even a novel about one of these women, this maid of Ludmila that I've already mentioned, and I shall come back to that. Now, before I actually tell you the story of the maid of Ludmila, which becomes the focus of all these traditions, partly because it is anomalous, because unlike these other women, of whom we have examples that are probably perfectly creditable in the late 19th, early 20th century, these mothers and widows, sisters, daughters-in-law, this one is anomalous because it is about a virgin, a maiden of Ludmila, and that is unique. And it is nevertheless cited time and again as the model for this kind of feminist, egalitarian agenda of Hasidism. And the person responsible for opening this line of thinking is Horodetsky, who in his article in Russian in 1909 presents the story, which I shall tell you in a minute, of the Maiden of Ludmila, but he precedes it with a comment that is very radical. He said, the Hasidic, wait a minute, I wanted to even read it to you. I think I have it here. The Jewish woman was given complete equality in the emotional, mystical, religious life of Beshtian Hasidism. Beshtian Hasidism, it is named after the founder, the supposed founder, Besht, his nickname. His real name is Israel Baal Shem Tov, and Besht is an acronym of Baal Shem Tov. And Baal Shem and Baal Shem Tov is the same, with or without the Tov. Tov means good. Literally, it means the master of the name, or the master of the good name. And the name in question is the divine name, and this is a Kabbalistic title. A master of the divine name is a person, a Kabbalist, who knows how to manipulate the divine name magically. And this is part of the aspects of, one of the aspects of what they call the practical Kabbalah, the way in which Kabbalah can use magically, the way you can actually effect change in the physical world by a certain manipulation which could be either in the way you pronounce it, or in the way you write it on amulets, or in the text that you're working on. Each letter that makes up the ineffable name of God, the name that you're not supposed to pronounce, Yod, Hei, Vav, Hei. In English they say Yahweh or Jehovah. My son, when he was little, was fascinated by the idea that there's this name that you're not allowed to pronounce. So he used to come and sit on my lap and say, say it. And I wouldn't. I can say it in English, Yahweh or Jehovah, but I wouldn't say it. So these letters are supposed to be concrete manifestation of divine power in the world. And by manipulating them, shifting them about, using combinations of them, permutations of them with other divine names, you are actually drawing down divine powers into the physical world and managing to perform miraculous feats. So this was a skill of Baal Shem, and the founder of Hasidism comes from that background. He's that kind of Kabbalist. So Beshtian Hasidism, the Hasidism of the Besht, the Hasidism supposedly founded by the Besht. So this is the opening line of this article in Vashod, in this journal. There follows a paragraph in which he mentions the names of several early Hasidic leaders, sisters, mothers, daughters, widows, and says, they say about them that they had the powers of a Rebbe, although he doesn't quite say that they were a Rebbe. They had certain supernatural powers, and people used to come to them to get their blessing. This is what a Rebbe gives. To give a blessing means to look after your well-being. If I give you a blessing, and a blessing for a particular thing, then it can be for having children, or for having male children, or for having children who survive. Quite often it is the question of whether they would survive because there was so much child mortality at the time. Or that I would be successful in business, or that a certain thing I really want would come about. So they used to come to the women as they come to the men for blessings, just for blessings. And he says about them in a very moderate tone, they were powerful, but of course they were not real full tzaddikim. Tzaddik is the Hebrew term meaning literally righteous man, which is the title in the Hebrew sources for one of them, for the Hasidic leader. Nowadays people say Rebbe, the Yiddish for rabbi. But there is the case, the anomalous case. There is one example where I can show you that where conditions were right and the woman was worthy of it, she could become a full-fledged Hasidic leader. Before I come to the story, I would also say that he then goes on to say that this is not surprising, because after all, and here he brings to bear those categories of intellectual and emotional Judaism that I mentioned, that he will develop later on as a framework for interpreting Jewish civilization, but it already appears here, because these women, of course, women inherently are emotional and men inherently are intellectual. And this was a mode of thinking that was universal at the time. Even to this day, there are some feminist psychologists. There's a very famous Harvard psychology professor who wrote a book, Men Are From Venus, Women Are From Mars, or the other way around, I can't remember, but in which he offers genuine, scientifically tested psychological insights about the different mental constitution of men and women. Although already in the 18th century, some pioneering feminists in Europe, kind of enlightenment, like Mary Wollstonecraft, were challenging precisely that, saying women are just as intellectual as men, it's just their education that stops them from realizing it. So it is an issue unresolved to this day. But Horodecki, as a matter of course, assumes that emotion is the realm of women, intellect is the realm of men, and therefore it is not surprising that Hasidism, which is so emotional in its manifest, and it is true that a Hasidic gathering of the devotees of a Hasidic Rebbe is emotionally very charged. People get excited, often with the help of alcohol, or and they become very emotional, and they shout, and they cry, and they sing, and whereas the typical image of the rabbinic scholar in the yeshiva, at least as it is described in 18th century sources, would be very cerebral, very cold, very quiet and analytical. So it is not surprising that Hasidism would be giving vent to women because it is so emotional. And he says it belongs historically to the whole strand of emotional Judaism, in which he puts together also messianism and mysticism. So women have a particular affinity, because they're so emotional, to mysticism and to messianism. And he even mentions the Sabbatean movement. Casually, in one sentence, it is no wonder the Sabbatean movement gave vent to women, gave an opportunity to women to stand out because it is so emotional. And I confess that when I first worked on this, and my first article about this, which started the whole debate about the issue, I still said, nonsense, show me women in Sabbateanism, what's so special about them? We don't know very much, the evidence is, all the things that I later had to go back on and say that on that he was right, but only on that. But at the time, I followed Scholem. Scholem, who wrote a monumental study of the Sabbatean movement, which, does it exist in Spanish translation? I wouldn't be surprised. No? Okay, it's been translated to many languages, and it is a masterpiece, I would say. It really is, of scholarship. Scholem was aware of all this evidence about the activities of women that we described here and talked about, but he dismissed them. He said they did not affect the way the movement developed. They did not initiate anything. They did not. He dismissed it as unimportant, even though the evidence was in front of him. So I had to then go back and say, I've changed my mind on this, But at the time, and my article, the first article was basically written as a critical reading of Horodecki, designed to demolish all his arguments one by one. And I tried to demolish even this one, dismiss this one anyway. So it is hardly surprising that women who are so inherently emotional should stand out in the Jewish mystical tradition, and here I must say I still am waiting for the evidence, because he doesn't provide any evidence. He just says in mysticism, in Sabbateanism, where he was right, as it turns out, and this culminates in Hasidism, where they actually are at the forefront. Now, his argument was not fully developed in this article, where all he does after that is tell us the story of the maid of Ludmilla, which is coming very soon. I keep saying, I'm promising it, but I haven't yet told it. But what he does do is in 1923, so the article published in 1909, in 1909 he was still very close to his origins. You know, he had left in 1907, so 2 years after he had left the Ukraine, he writes down this in the article and publishes it in Russian. In 1923, he has already been studying in Zurich, in Bern, and in Berlin. He becomes a Zionist. He is exposed to early Jewish feminism, which is beginning to happen. In Berlin, there was a woman called Berta Pappenheim, who was a social worker and started a whole movement for improvement of the lot of women in Jewish society. She was concerned about the white slave trade which was going on, where Polish Jewish women from poor families were sent to South America to work as prostitutes. You know, she exposed it and fought against it. So there was a stirring of Jewish feminism in Berlin where he was living, plus Zionist ideology from the very beginning had within it a utopian, gender egalitarian strand. It was a very noble ideal, which the early settlers in Palestine, starting from 1882 and going on into the 20th century, still believed, and they sent their poor women to dig roads and rocks and to do physical work, and the ideology also made the women proud to do it. You know, don't send me to the kitchen, don't send me to look after the children, I'm working an agricultural worker like all the men. So this was something that he absorbed, and he developed the idea, which he then publishes in lots of other publications, that Hasidism offers the most authentic model for the rebirth of the Jewish people on its land. You know, why authentic? Because the other models that were available, the socialist model, the reform model, you know, all this, these are all extraneous. They come from outside. They're not indigenous. They're not springing from authentic Jewish roots. Hasidism is wholesome. It is something that grew within Judaism. Nowadays we think that there might well have been influences around, you know, but to him it still seemed possible to say this is authentic Judaism. It's all written in Hebrew and spoken in Yiddish, and it grew entirely within the Jewish community. This is the good model to adopt for the construction of a new society in Palestine for the Jews, free from all the maladies, all the diseases of diaspora. So he's not advocating orthodoxy by any means. This is a kind of a spiritual revival, secular Zionism, but modeled on Hasidism. And actually, when you look at some of the early patterns of Zionist settlement in Palestine, quite a lot of the vocabulary that was used by the early settlers, the secular pioneers, came from Hasidism, and many of them had a Hasidic background. They became secular, but they were brought up. So the word kibbutz, which I think you all know, the utopian collective settlement, is a Hasidic term. The gathering of the Hasidic followers at the court of their leader, the pilgrim, when they go on pilgrimage and stay sometimes for a week to be there, to be present, to hear his teaching, is called kibbutz, you know. And other features of early Zionist, secular Zionists were indeed drawn from the Hasidic experience. So he advocates Hasidism as a wholesome, Jewish, good model for a basis for a new society of the Jewish people, cured of the diseases of diaspora. And so he develops in the book published in 1923 a much more radical picture than the one he depicts in the article in 1909. In 1909, the tone is still quite calm. Curiosities, these women are there, and this strange case of the maid of Ludmilla is coming. but he doesn't yet pronounce categorically that, full equality was granted to women. This phrase comes from the book in 1923. When I first saw the difference, I actually wrote basically what I'm saying to you now, that there's a development in him over the period, between the period. However, more recently, a colleague, Gadi Sagiv in Israel, brought to my attention, and this is nice because I started this debate, people constantly come back with more evidence for me, which is wonderful. So he showed me a postcard from Simon Dubno that he found in Archion Gnazim, in one of the archives in Israel. A postcard written by Simon Dubno, who was the editor of Voschod, the journal published in Russia, where he published the article in 1909, in which Dubno is replying to Horodetsky. It's a short postcard to what must be, and we don't have Horodetsky's letter, but it must have been, we can see, a complaint from Horodetsky to Dubno, the editor of the journal, must have complained, Horodetsky must have complained that Dubnov interfered too actively in the article and toned it down. Because Dubnov says, and as far as your complaint that I have changed some sentences, there's no ground for your argument because women don't count as anything in Hasidism. So I now think that Dubnov must have changed the tone of the article, and my whole theory about how he had developed, all these things as a result of being exposed to German feminism and Zionism may be wrong, that he might have all along wanted to have this, radical picture, and Dubnov wouldn't let him. Dubnov clearly interfered. So I have this postcard now, a photocopy of the postcard as a reminder, that I should reverse one section of my case. But I don't reverse the rest. And the rest goes like that. His argument, when he talks about women being emotional and therefore very important in mysticism without any evidence, in Sabbateanism, just mentioning Eva Frank, Jacob Frank's daughter, and the wives of Sabbatai Tzvi, again, he doesn't supply any evidence, he just casually throws the name. But when it comes to Hasidism, which for him is the peak of this trend of egalitarian, then he begins to speak in greater detail. And he makes an argument on 3 points to demonstrate how Hasidism granted equality to women. And this is in the book version in 1923. The first one, he says, it greatly improved the position of women in the family and in the community by virtue of the new connection to the Rebbe, to the charismatic leader. Because the connection equated a husband and wife. Both of them were affiliated to him, and that created a new equality between husband and wife, which in the normal kind of synagogue practice and so on, the women were very marginal. The second point was Hasidism, and he uses very dramatic language, opened the gates of scholarship to women. There was always the notion that women, because of already in the Talmud, you are warned not to educate women, because to educate women, it's like teaching them sexual licentiousness, so women should be kept out, and this was often observed. And women on the whole were not very well educated until the modern era. There were no frameworks for Jewish education for women, as far as we know. Whereas we do know a lot about the frameworks of education for men in late antiquity, in the Middle Ages, right up to the modern period. So it opened the gates of scholarship to women. How? By producing a rich literature in Yiddish, which was the vernacular, which was the women's tongue. And the third argument is the most bombastic and kind of written in a mood of celebration, is that a woman could even become a leader like the man, a charismatic leader like the man, so long as she was worthy of it and the circumstances were conducive. So then I proceed to demolish each one of these arguments as follows. as far as improving the status of women in the family, in the community, this is simply impossible to accept, because as far as I can see, and I have had since then collected more and more evidence about this, the women did not connect themselves to the Rebbe. Directly, certainly not. The women, I mean, the evidence on this is conflicting, but I'll tell you how. What we do know for sure, and this is true even to this day, a woman would not have a foothold, would not be allowed into the highlight of the experience of being with the Rebbe, which is sitting at his table. Table comes to be, now that we are dealing with communities of Hasidim of thousands, it's a symbolic thing, you know, it began by an intimate kind of thing sitting around the table. Now it is a symbolic table and it's a big hall. But she would never be allowed to sit there and listen to him give his teaching. Never. Not a foothold. Not even a gallery for women. Out. And the women, as for whether women ever came to the court, we have conflicting evidence. On the one hand, we have lots of complaints from the very beginning, right to the 20th century. And I would say probably even, no, and in fact in the case of one big Hasidic community today as well, women complain that they're being abandoned. Because Hasidism, at the beginning certainly, appealed primarily to one type of person, and we have evidence for this. They are called, in the Hasidic sources, they're called Bnei HaNeurim, youth. And that is a very specific term. It means young men in the early years of marriage. And young men in the early years of marriage, in the class that was attracted to Hasidism, as far as we can tell, which is by no means the uneducated riffraff, it was the educated classes, would have been boys of anything between 12 and 14. The age of marriage among the rich, not amongst the poor. The poor couldn't afford to marry so young. But amongst the educated, and education and money went together, marriage was early to preserve the sexual purity of the couple. The girls at 12 on, and the boys at 14. And we have certain autobiographical pieces of evidence about it that make it perfectly clear. By the time they would go to the Rebbe for the first time, they would probably have a wife and 1 or 2 babies at home. Moreover, they would be living at their in-laws. That was part of the deal. There was an institution called Este in Yiddish, whereby one of the conditions when 2 families come together by marriage is that the family of the bride would support the young couple for a fixed number of years, sometimes as many as 10 years or 15 years, financially support them, so that the husband would be able to devote himself to study. Usually, the wife would then be involved in the family business, whatever it is, she would be working and looking after the children.
This was the same thing with Sephardim, which is part of a dowry.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, this is yeah, thank you, because I wasn't sure that it existed in the Sephardi world as well. So, we have one beautiful description of what this was like. We have several, but one that is the earliest. From exactly the period when Hasidism begins to form, not yet a movement, but it is already a phenomenon that is becoming noticed. We have an autobiography by a man called Shlomo Maimon. He is a Jew born in Lithuania, brilliant. One of my friends and colleagues whom I mentioned when Miguel was here, because he's a Spinoza expert, Itzik Melamed, says he is the only modern Jewish philosopher. He completely dismisses Buber, Hermann Cohen, Rosenzweig. They are maybe philosophers, they are not Jewish philosophers, they know nothing about Judaism, which is true, because they don't have the traditional rabbinic training. Whereas Solomon Maimon was brought up in childhood, born to the scholarly classes, trained in rabbinic scholarship, and as a young boy, we don't know exactly, probably around 14, he's already married, has 2 or 3 babies, and is living with his in-laws. And he writes this autobiography in German, Years later, in the 1790s, it is published in 1790, probably wrote it in the late 80s. By that time, he had left Eastern Europe, he had gone to Berlin as a kind of an enlightener, a maskil, although he eventually abandons the Jewish world altogether and becomes a German philosopher, a fairly respected German philosopher, Kantian philosopher. He corresponded with Kant. And he has a spot in the history of German idealist philosophy in the late 18th century. Prolific writer in German, but also wrote one book published very well known in Hebrew, which is his commentary on the Guide of the Perplexed by Maimonides, and at least one other, Chefetz Shlomo, which has remained in manuscript and may now be coming out thanks to the efforts of Itzik Melamed in Hebrew, but is still in manuscript. Anyway, his autobiography was published in German, first in installments in a journal, nothing to do with Jewish studies, and eventually as a book, and became quite well known. And in it he has a wonderful chapter describing his first encounter with Hasidism. So he's living with his in-laws, and he describes what it was like. And it must have been like that for many young men. It was a nightmare. He describes his mother-in-law as a Xantipa. You know, Xantipa was the wife of Socrates, who got a popular reputation as being a real witch, you know. She beats him up. And he's only a boy, and this woman beats him up and doesn't give him the money that was promised, and humiliates him. And he does childish, he's a child basically. He describes once hiding under her bed at night and frightening her to death by making the noises of a ghost. Woo, woo, you know. So the book is capturing scenes from that family life from which he drops out. He goes away. He goes away for months and months and months. He's very intellectual and very spiritually restless. And he starts wandering, and he makes a living by being a tutor here and there. He's wandering to rich people's children. But he wants to travel to find some other outlet. He meets another young man who tells him, have you heard about these Hasidic leaders, about this? You know, and he mentions 2 or 3, and he mentions one, and we now know this is the Maggid of Mezrich, the second great leader of Hasidism. Why don't you go and see what it's like? So Solomon Maimon asks him, well, can I just turn up? I mean, what does it mean to... And he says, no, it's easy. You just turn up, go there, and they'll accept you. You know, there's no ritual admission, no... So he goes, and to go means from Lithuania all the way down to Volhynia. He walks. It takes months. He has no money. He just makes a bit of... And he describes sessions at the court of the Maggid of Mezrich. And the period must be the 1760s, working the chronology. He doesn't date them. And most of the things he reports in the name of the Maggid of Mezrich that he heard, the teachings, we can actually find in the, it became the published teachings of the Maggid of Mezrich. So he is remembering correctly some striking things that he heard, and gives us other descriptions. He is a typical recruit, restless young men who are actually abandoning family and home and children and mother-in-law and the whole business, and they're like droppers out in the 60s, bourgeois young kids who just drop out and go to live on the beach somewhere and wear jeans and smoke marijuana and just, not, instead of doing what was expected, which is going to business or going to the university and so on. It's that kind of mentality. And there are lots of descriptions of B'nai HaNe'urim being the first people to be drawn, all of them married, and all of them described as abandoning their wives. And we have in the attacks on Hasidism, when the campaign against Hasidism begins in 1772, one of the first complaints about them is that they abandon their responsibility to their families. They go to the Rebbe, they stay there for 3 months, and not only that, they go, when do they go? They go on the classic times for being with the Rebbe to listen to his sermon, to hear his Torah, Shabbat. There's an institution of the third Sabbath meal, so Shabbat afternoon, or the Jewish festivals, which means precisely the times when the husband is needed at home, Pesach, you need the husband to ritually celebrate that which Jewish tradition places at home as part of the cult, not in the synagogue. There you go. The women and the children are left, So we have quite a lot of complaints which confirm the picture of a pattern of abandoning home. And what do they find? They get, from the description of Shlomo Maimon, and we have a few others that are a bit later, but this is the earliest one. It's a community that is emotionally very charged. It is entirely male, young men, with the Rebbe at the center. The language that they speak, and that is very clear in the early Hasidic text, the earliest that we have, it is the language of love. The Rebbe is described as father, and they are his children. They are sitting around a table, whether they're actually a concrete table or a symbolic table, but it is a meal. In other words, they are creating an alternative family setting. Mm-hmm. And it is a spiritual family, male only, mm-hmm. in which they're free from the distractions of wives and babies and mother-in-law and sex. Mm-hmm. And they are spiritually uplifted. And this is cool, this is exciting. You can see that this is a very attractive alternative. And it is drawing these young men. So this is the improvement in the position of women in society. On the other hand, I have to tell you, there's also evidence completely, sometimes in the writings of the same person, from amongst the mitnagdim, as they are called, the opponents of Hasidism, the earliest text against Hasidism that we have. On the one hand, they say this, but then they also say, well, Hasidism is such nonsense, it is vulgar emotionalism, it is rubbish, and only women and children would be interested in it. So it's kind of suggesting, and some scholars have concluded from it, that the courts were full of women. And the truth of the matter, as much as I was able to establish it, is that there was tremendous variety of practice. There were certainly some Hasidic courts where women were not allowed to put a foothold, never came. And some Hasidic leaders were explicitly discouraged them. I have one beautiful piece of evidence where a Hasidic Rebbe says, in my early years, I used to allow the women to come. They would never come into the room where I'm delivering my teaching. But they would come and they would give a little piece of paper and settle on which they would write what blessing they want, and then my servant would bring it to me and I would... But then the number of people became too big. The town couldn't cope with so many visitors. So the first thing I said, no, ban the women, no more women. And there are some descriptions there late, but I think they might be preserving a correct memory. I can't be sure of it, whereby some Hasidic Rebbes would allow women to come in, but with all kinds of restrictions. They wouldn't actually hand anything directly to them, or in the case of one of them, he would turn his back and they would stand and speak to him from behind the door that would be left slightly open so he would hear what they wanted blessings for. And some of them never mention women, and perhaps from the silence you can guess they were not there. So there was no uniform practice. But abandonment for long periods is still a theme that you get in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Descriptions of, again, from autobiographical accounts of people who say, and comes Rosh Hashanah, the days of awe, the period between the day of the Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, between the Day of Atonement and the New Year, which are the times for penitence, before the great day of Yom Kippur, when your fate up there is decided for the year. We would go with our fathers. This is a man describing his childhood experience. Me and my brothers and my father would go, and we would travel by train by this time to the Rebbe, leaving our mothers and sisters at home. They say that as a matter of course. My sense is that this was, in many cases, how it was. At any rate, whatever it was, even if they could come, there was a clear boundary they could not cross. They could not actually hear the Torah of the Rebbe, which is the peak of the experience. This is where you have the spiritual elation. And if they came to the court, there's no inkling of any kind of framework whereby they could be treated as a community, collectively. They came at odd times. There was no particular time, there was no framework. They were not there on Shabbat and they were not there on festivals. They would come haphazardly. So even if they were present, they were not part of the Hasidic constituency. They were not members of the community. They were attaching themselves to it. Because it must be said, when you try to think, what did a woman born into or marrying into a Hasidic family have felt? Did she feel that she was a Hasid? She was a member of this? My sense is that at the very beginning, it was clearly entirely male, and it was a voluntary and very informal association, like Solomon Maimon describes. He meets a boy who tells him, just go there. And there's no mention of women there, not even the wife of the Maggid of Mezrich, just go. So it was a group of men. But within a few decades, the movement becomes institutionalized. So the court develops as an institution, not just a casual kind of home where the Rebbe is and around his table. And it also, the leadership becomes institutionalized. Gradually, by the end of the 18th century, the first decades of the 19th century, we get for the first time transmission of the post of Rebbe by heredity. The Rebbe's son, or son-in-law, or grandson, if there isn't a son. This was not the case at the beginning. At the beginning, nobody expected any continuation. There was a guru, you came to him, you were with him. When he died, that was the end of the matter. And we have a lot of evidence of such people who left no trace. One of the most famous Hasidic leaders of the early generation, Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, some of you may have heard of him. He's got, there's stories about him galore. He's supposed to be a great. There's no group to this day. He died, and that was the end of it. So you begin to get the expectation that there is some office here that can be transmitted only at the turn of the 18th and 19th century, and then it's a minority. And you can see that Hasidism, as it emerges as a movement, is experimenting with all kinds of models for perpetuating itself. And this becomes the dominant one eventually. Nowadays it matters, of course, it is hereditary. So as the leadership becomes hereditary, so does the association with it become hereditary. So you are born into a family which is by already father and grandfather who are associated with this particular, not with another, with this one. So you have no choice in the matter, you are born into it. And the question is, what kind of identity does it give you? Does it mean that you are actually a member of it as a woman? Or does it mean that you're married into it, or that you are born into it, but effectively it doesn't really change your sense of yourself in a more significant way? You have a connection with it, but it is a very vicarious, it is indirect, it is through your husband, or through your father, or through your children in the end. It is something, but it is not the same as the experience of the men who are the devotees of the Rebbe and who hear his teaching and who have private audiences with him. Anyway, the question of equality between men and women as a result of the affiliation to the Rebbe, which Hordetsky tries to offer, cannot be acceptable in those terms. Whatever it was, the relationship of men and women to the Rebbe was different. And I don't myself believe that women were actively identifying with the ideas. They probably didn't even know what the teachings were. They might have known a few practical things that the men brought home, because, for example, Hasidism develops, for a variety of halachic reasons, of legal reasons, a different way of slaughtering meat, which was more strict than what was normal in their environment. And a lot of the attacks on them is for that, because it had financial implications. If you opt out of the communal shchita, of the communal slaughtering, you're not paying the tax for. And so the communities objected to suddenly losing growing numbers of people who were setting up their own slaughtering and wouldn't pay into the communal. So I suppose if you were buying the meat, if the woman was, she would be aware that she's buying the meat from one of their own slaughterers, and not from the ones who are not Hasidic. So that would be the extent of awareness of being Hasidic. But there would be none of the mystical experience, none of the ecstatic experience, or the union with the Rebbe that the men would have had. So that was my critique of that point about the egalitarian agenda of Hasidism. As for education, gates of scholarship in Yiddish. Now it is true that Hasidism does produce a significant body of literature in Yiddish. But what kind of literature and when? The first Hasidic book published in Yiddish is the Tales of the Life of the Baal Shem Tov, Shivchei HaBesh, published for the first time in Hebrew in December 1814, and the first edition in Yiddish, which is probably a translation, although there's some argument about which is the original. I am inclined to the view that the Yiddish is a translation of the Hebrew, in 1815, a year later. And then within the next 2 or 3 decades, you have 2 or 3 other editions in Yiddish. So it was clearly a success, it was popular. Moreover, some of these Yiddish editions, on the title page, say that this book, as was common in the publications of Yiddish books from the beginning of early Yiddish publishing, this book is intended for women and for men who are like women, or a formula like that, namely men who are not scholars, who can't read Hebrew. For people who are ignorant. So some, not all of the editions actually have that. They are kind of addressing themselves to women. The fact is, A, that I have not seen any evidence of Hasidic women, to the extent that I've tried to find evidence about what women read, Hasidic women read. And the time for reading for women who are very busy normally would be Shabbat afternoon. And when we have descriptions of the repertoire, of the library that women were reading, they're not reading the life of the Baal Shem Tov, they're reading the standard ethical tracts that were translated early into Yiddish. Some historical chronicles, some romances, that had been translated into Yiddish, just belles, exciting stories about Alexander the Great, but they're not reading this, as far as I can tell. Again, silence is not good evidence. You can't draw conclusive views from evidence of silence, but it is nevertheless suggestive. Moreover, it is significant that when Hasidism begins to publish itself, when it begins to put its own message in print, when it begins to sense itself as a movement that has a certain cohesive program, and you begin to get books, Hasidic books published, the first one is 1780. So between the public, and then there's a whole cluster. By the end of the 18th century, there's about 40 to 50 Hasidic books of teachings, mystical teachings, published by the Hasidim. That is the literature that Hasidism wants to put into the world, by which it wants to propagate itself, not the stories about Shivchei HaBesh. When Shivchei HaBesh is first published, it is treated within Hasidism with great ambivalence. Are these things worthy of being even published? This is just stories, this is just history. They don't have much respect for the genre of history, and it is not by accident that etymologically story and history are the same word. Narratives about events, that's not, what you need is all the mystical teachings for Hasidism, Talmudic, analysis for rabbinic scholars, these kind of stories. There are some Hasidic leaders who object to the publication of this kind of stuff. All right, you can tell them, you can sit and tell stories, don't publish them. And what is even more significant is that after the publication of this book in praise of the Baal Shem Tov, a collection of the praises of the founder of Hasidism, in 1814 and in Yiddish in 1815 and several other editions, no more books of this genre are published by Hasidism for at least 50 years, more than 50 years. Silence, which is suggestive that Hasidism was not entirely happy about this, but it's not the voice it wants to make public. You begin to get more books with stories about other Hasidic leaders and other stories about the early Hasidic leaders being published for the first time in both Hebrew and Yiddish from the 1860s on. At first in 1861, only 2 or 3, but as time moves on and into the 20th century, by the First World War, between 1860 and the First World War, there's several hundred of them. And many of them are in Hebrew and many of them are in Yiddish. So these books are available. But these are not books of Hasidic teaching. These are not the books Hasidism wants to project. And many of them are actually written by people who are not fully within the Hasidic movement. In fact, the first two that come out in the 1860s were written by people who were indeed brought up in the Hasidic world and became maskilim, enlighteners. And they're writing it as bell letter. They're writing it to make money, basically, because this is a good read, fantastical stories. So it is not the authentic voice of Hasidism. It is not what Hasidism wants to project to the world. So if you say Hasidic women, the gates of scholarship were open to them, and this is the literature that is available to them if they ever read it. I imagine that by the end of the 19th century, they probably did, like lots of other people read it. These books were flooding the market, published usually very cheaply, very badly, books that are not easily preserved. Martin Buber, who was interested in the Hasidic tales, had a huge collection of them, which went to the National Library in Israel. And if you try to look at this collection now, the books are disintegrating. I mean, really, some of them are just bits of paper that dissolve in your hand as you touch them. They need to be conserved. Also, the quality of the paper, very acidy paper that doesn't survive well. Whereas books from the 16th century are wonderful and beautifully intact. So much for opening the gates of scholarship. It didn't really create a community of Hasidic women who are informed about Hasidism at all. They may have had, as I say, some connection to it that would have some practical expression, but they're certainly not brought into the world of Hasidic mystical speculation. And finally, the Maid of Ludmig, leadership. The most dramatic story is of the Maid of Ludmig. And in brief, her story is like that. We're not clear, he doesn't have dates, but we are given the impression that this is from the early days of Hasidism, probably the beginning of the 19th century. Later on, people try to date her 1805, 1806, somebody says 1815. Let's say, all right, because I believe that she's an authentic figure, I'll say in a minute. So there is this girl, her name is Hannah Rachel Werbemacher, born to a family of a well-to-do and educated father. And as always in kind of semi-legendary traditions, she is beautiful, absolutely beautiful, and she is very gifted intellectually. So from an early age, she displays the tendency for learning. So she learns Hebrew, which is very unusual. Women don't learn Hebrew. If they learn to read and write, they learn the Hebrew alphabet so as to be able to just follow the prayers without understanding a word. And they would have Yiddish as the spoken language, and they could read Yiddish. If they could read, some may not have been able to read, but they certainly don't read Hebrew. This girl learns Hebrew. She starts with Bible, she proceeds to Mishnah, she proceeds to Midrashim, and then she starts Gemara. She also prays a lot. She prays all day. And she prays like a man 3 times a day, which women hardly ever do. She comes for morning service, afternoon, and evening. So this is observed, but that's fine. So far, so good. When she reaches, and again, we don't have exact age, the marriage day age, she is betrothed. An engagement is announced with a boy who grew up in the same milieu, who was her childhood mate. They were friends together. She loves him. This is a wonderful match. They're still too young to marry, but the engagement is announced. And then there follows, according to custom, a period until the marriage, until the wedding, when they're not supposed to be in touch with one another. So the story goes that she became very distressed by the fact that she had lost her best mate, her childhood mate. She's distressed. Soon after, her mother dies suddenly. And this enhances the state of kind of despondency and depression that she was already showing when she was no longer allowed to meet her beloved, destined husband. And she stops seeing people, she closes herself at home, she only goes out to visit her mother's tomb in the cemetery every day. And on one of these occasions, when she's in the cemetery visiting, she suddenly passes out. She faints, she loses consciousness, and she stays in a coma for a certain time. They don't say how long, for quite a while. Then she recovers consciousness. And when she recovers consciousness, she announces that while she was in that state, a new soul, the soul of a tzaddik, of a male tzaddik, had established itself within her. She says, I will never marry. I refuse to marry. And she starts praying like a man. She puts on a talit, she puts on tefillin, which is extremely unusual. We have a few cases in the, even the Talmud knows to tell us that the daughter of King Saul did it, which gives it a little bit of legitimacy, but communities disapprove very much, historically, of women who do that. So she starts using the garments, the prayer, shawl, and so on of a man, and she starts fulfilling all the commandments that are for men, not for women. And she is becoming known locally as an extremely pious woman. She's locking herself at home. She wouldn't see anybody, but the stories about her proliferate, so that people from the neighborhood begin to come to have a look at this. And then she begins to give blessings. They ask her for blessings from behind the closed door, and she delivers them. They can hear her, and she gives people blessings. So a whole crowd of people come, and then she begins to deliver Torah, to give teachings like Hasidic Rebbe, and the crowd grows. Now, the local Hasidic leadership, according to the story, feels very uncomfortable about that. And they consult about what to do, and they call in the most important Hasidic leader of the region, which is Mordechai of Chernobyl, who happens to be the grandfather or great-grandfather of Horodetsky, the historian, which is the dominant Hasidic dynasty in that region, by this one of the early ones where hereditary transmission was established, but he is the first. So Mordechai of Chernobyl comes and says, must marry her off. So they force her to marry. She refused to consummate the marriage, so the marriage is annulled. So they marry her again, and again she refuses to consummate. And that, however, even though she remains a virgin to the end of her life, she remains a maiden, what happens, according to the tradition, is that at that point, after she's been twice married and so on, people stop coming, they abandon her. And then we lose sight of her, except that all we are told is that she ended her life in the Holy Land. She went on pilgrimage to the Holy Land, where apparently she just died in obscurity. We have no trace of her at that point. Now, this is the story as he first gives it in the article, Horodetsky in the Russian article in 1909, and then repeats it in the book, but interprets it much more radically. And in response to the article in 1909, in the same journal, 2 years later, there's a little piece, a page and a half, response from one of the readers, I don't know who he is, M. Klatsko, I tried to find out more about him, who also comes from the same region in the Ukraine, and he says, I found that very interesting. It agrees with some traditions that I've heard in my locality about this woman. And they say that she once went to visit the town of Staro-Konstantinov, in Hebrew they call it Konstantin Yashan, which is another Volhynian town in the same part of the Ukraine, and that the synagogue was filled with women, the main hall of the synagogue, not the women's gallery, it was full of women, and she gave a sermon. And they say that she traveled from town to town in the region where women were coming to listen to her. So this is a different aspect, Suddenly she's traveling, not secluded like a nun, like a hermit in her room, an anchorite, and also she is addressing herself only to women. So a different tradition from the same area and about the same time that this man has heard. And the only other bit of information that is not in Horodetsky's original account comes very late in a piece published in 1940, probably written before, by a man called Bieber. It was published as an article in a journal that was published in Palestine in the 30s and 40s. and eventually was incorporated in the memorial book, in the Ziesko book, the whole series, there are thousands of them, of memorial books for Jewish communities in Eastern Europe that were wiped out in the Holocaust. So it's a whole genre of books, written after the war, in the 50s, 60s, some of them still, collecting memoirs, some maps, some articles, some drawings, whatever they have. The community of people, survivors or their relatives from these particular localities, saw to it that such volumes would be published, and they are published usually either in Hebrew or in Yiddish, sometimes in other languages too. So this piece was also incorporated in the memorial book of the town of Ludmir, which is where this girl, Hannah, the maid, comes from. But that was in the 60s. So the earliest attestation of this article is in 1940 that I found, and it basically has Horodecky's evidence, but it adds one more detail, that while she was in Palestine, she collaborated with a local Kabbalist, and they tried together to bring about the advent of the Messiah, and they failed. Just this one piece. I don't know where it comes from. Everything else that is written in all that literature that I looked at that first brought me to this in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s is basically, that's the kind of tradition that it builds on. Now, the story, as Horodecki interprets it, is a success story. Look, you have a woman who actually functions as a Hasidic leader in the full sense of the word. Anomalous because A, she's a virgin, whereas all these other women who were given a lot of respect, and so on, the mothers and the widows and the daughters and so on, were all related closely to the family of were all married and had children, and she comes from a family not of a Hasidic leader. She's an outsider, whereas all these other women are intimately connected to a male Hasidic leader. And I must say that the tradition whereby women who belong to the household of a great figure in the history of Jewish intellectual history, the great Bible commentators, the great philosophers, the great rabbinic authorities, from antiquity, already in the Talmud, right through to the present day, are usually credited, or often credited, with certain distinctions of their own, sometimes scholarly distinctions, because they kind of, the aura of the great male leader, whatever field of distinction he is from, kind of percolates onto them, a little bit of it sticks to them. So we have evidence in medieval already in the Talmud we have Bruria, we mentioned her before, the one woman in the whole of the Talmud who is credited with scholarly erudition. She can defeat the rabbis in an argument, in a halachic argument, but she has a bad end, but she is the daughter of the greatest sage of her day and the wife of the greatest sage of the day. So she is a model. In the Middle Ages we have women in the family of Rashi, the great Bible commentator, women who are connected by family ties to some of the Tosafites, the great Talmud commentators in France and Germany in the 13th century, 14th century. They were known for having certain expertise in halakha. In some cases we know that they used to write responsa to women on matters particularly connecting to the laws of women, particularly the laws of menstruation. So they had more practical knowledge and they understood the halakha, and they would be the ones, rather than the men, who would answer the question. So here and there we have some evidence that Judaism can accommodate a certain kind of distinction that is attributed to women by their close proximity, by family kinship, to great men. And it is perhaps not surprising that if the Hasidism, within that boundary, can stretch as much as possible. Hasidism, because don't forget that Hasidism places the personality of the charismatic leader at the very center of its theology and its social organization. He is the very center. So if you're going to get an expansion of that tradition whereby women who are connected to the dominant, distinguished figure pick up some of the kind of distinction of the male, Hasidism would be a very fertile ground for that, because personality is so crucial to it, much more so than in any of these other fields. The maid of Ludmi is not that. She's not married, which means she's not normative. You remember what we said in connection with Sabbatianism, that very anomalously you get virgins credited with greater capacity for receiving the message, completely un-Jewish. And there I think it really is syncretistic. I think, for Jewish traditional minds, the virgin is a tragedy. I mean, if she remains a virgin, it's a failure of a woman, of a person to develop to their full. It's like somebody whose growth was stunted, was arrested. So this maid of Ludmir, and I'm sure this is also part of the same phenomenon. And after all, we are dealing with an environment in the Ukraine where there are on the landscape female saints of the Russian Orthodox Church, female saints of the Uniate Church, of the Catholic tradition. It's not an unheard of thing in the Christian environment that they are living in. So this woman really, in many ways, conforms to that type, not to the normative Jewish type, which the relatives of the great Hasidic leaders who were credited with certain supernatural powers all are. They're all married, they all have children, they all do the normal thing. And in addition, they have this kind of special power. Now, I must also tell you, as I already alluded, that I believe the woman did exist. And in fact, I believe there might have been more like her. That the woman existed, I suspect strongly, because thanks to again, this kind of process where you write something that starts debate, other people come to you with more information. So one day I had a visit from a girl, a young woman from the University of Denver, Colorado, who was writing an MA on something to do with the old Yishuv, the Jewish religious old settlement in the Holy Land, Ashkenazi, is distinct from the much older local Oriental and Sephardi community. So, I mean, this is really the beginning of Jewish Ashkenazi immigration in significant numbers to the Holy Land in the 18th century. The turn of the 18th century begins, and during the 18th century there are certain groups that come. So suddenly in Palestine, in the Holy Land, there are Ashkenazi communities. So she was working on that, and she was looking at the census of the Jewish population of the Holy Land that was commissioned by Moses Montefiore, the great king of the Jews in the 19th century, the most famous Jewish the diplomat of the Jews. He was very involved in the Jewish settlement in Eretz Israel, in the Holy Land, and he commissioned he had his own clerks, he paid them, to collect demographic information about the Jewish community all over the Holy Land. And there were 5 censuses between the 1863 and 1875. Every few years, his clerks would go and collect information. And this is preserved in beautiful manuscript volumes where information is given about names. First of all, each community is described as a kollel, which is a term very specific to the Palestinian situation, describing a particular locality from which these Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, had come. He also covers the Sephardim, but for the Ashkenazim, he has the kollel of Volin, the kollel of Rysen, of Belarus, Lithuania. So the Volinian kollel, which is where the town Ludmi is, has information about widows, alongside other things. So in the list of the names of the widows, a woman called Chana Rachel in one and Rachel Chana in the other, who is said to have arrived in the Holy Land in 1806 and to have died in 1895 as an old woman. And she is described as alone, and as being a strange term from a wealthy family, And they also document the sources of income. So she has her own funds that presumably she had brought this particular widow. She is described unusually as rabbanit, which normally is either the wife of a rabbi or a modern type female rebbe, rabbah, as they now say in Israel. So it's a bit distinguishing her by this title. We can't be 100% sure. There are one or two other details. She has no children. Under the name of the husband, there's no name of husband. It's very possible that this is the woman, who appears twice. I mean, this girl came, we went together to what was then where these volumes were being kept in the Jewish College Library. And I published it as just at that time. My original article in English was published in Hebrew translation, and I got enough time to offer an appendix in which I offered that. And at almost the same time, a year later, quite independently, an American Jewish scholar, Nathaniel Deutsch, published an article first, and eventually he published a whole book about the Maid of Ludmir, the Maiden of Ludmir. His starting point was my own work, and he expanded it. The only difference between him and me is that I dismissed all these fictional and journalistic accounts from the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s in Yiddish and so on as lacking in any historical root other than the information collected by Horodecki. And he, being more of a postmodern scholar, thinks that the difference between fact and fiction is not so significant, and he incorporates all this information to construct a full biography of the Maid of Ludmir, which to me seems fantastical, but he takes it. And he also went to the Ukraine and tried to collect more what people today in post-communist Bolivia, what they remember about the Maid of Ludmir. Anybody there who ever heard of it would have read, all this literature. So, different approach, but the book is a wonderful read, and contains Horodecki's information as well. So, whereas Horodecki celebrates this as a history of success, there we go, a woman who was worthy, the circumstances she became, I see it as a failure on all scores. She is a deviant, and she is somebody who invites suppression by the Hasidic leadership. In other words, even though I believe that this woman existed and maybe did function for a while as a leader in her own right, it's perfectly plausible to me. And even though I believe that there may have been others like her, the historical question that interests me is not whether it happened or not, and I believe that it probably happened, but whether Hasidism put that on its flag, whether this was a Hasidic agenda. And to this, the answer is categorically no. To the extent that Hasidism was aware of it, if it did happen, which I believe it did, it made every effort to silence it, which is why there's not a single mention, absolutely nothing before Horodecki. Now again, I'm going over time, I'm sorry. In that wonderful, auspicious way in which people come to you with more evidence as you become the address for it. Yonatan Meir, who is a younger colleague now in Beersheba University, sends me one day a reference. He says, I found the Maid of Ludmir before Horodecki, mentioned before Horodecki. So I got very agitated and very excited, but it turns out to be. So that is in fact further confirmation that she probably existed. But the source is a Maskilic book, published in Kiev in 1884, and it is a parody not on the Maid of Ludmir, but on some other man who had published a traditional type of book of Chilukim. This is a genre that the Maskilim could mock, because it is a genre, it is a kind of the degenerate state of Talmudic scholarship. When Talmudic scholarship becomes a bit like you say about scholasticism, how many rabbis can stand on the head of one pin. It becomes a kind of a rather artificial way of analyzing the Talmudic text by raising artificial contradictions, and it's a kind of a game, an intellectual game that is actually rather sterile, when you become very clever at setting up a false problem and solving it. And then, So this is an attack on this genre by a man who is already an enlightened Jew in Kiev in 1884, mocking a book that was published a year before, that is that type of book, and making it an attack ad hominem. He attacks the author and focuses the attack on the daughter of the daughter of this man, who apparently was quite a learned young woman, and he likens her to the maid of Ludmi, and he says, and he mentions, there was a woman in Ludmi like her, and she is even more than the maid of Ludmi. And then he kind of so exaggerates the scholarship of this daughter of the man he is attacking. He says, and soon she will be invited to the rabbinate of Vilna, which is the most, she's so scholarly. So the one and only reference to this woman, which in itself is interesting because it confirms that people knew about this story outside the immediate, that this is Kiev, it's the Ukraine, but nevertheless is a hostile mockery, rather. So it suggests, and I also found a brief reference, 2.5 lines, in a hagiographical book about the Gaon of Vilna, the chief opponent of Hasidism, the greatest Talmudic authority of his day, who conducted the campaign against Hasidism, died in 1797. So there's a cluster of books by his devotees and students who admire him, that is in itself an influence of Hasidism, that is basically a collection of hagiographical tales about him. And in it, it says, one day they told the Gaon, they told him, that there was a woman in a certain town who was prophesying and who was studying and fasting and wouldn't marry. And he said, marry her off and she'll be all right. And they did, and it was, and it'll be all right, and he did, and it was. So, I don't know whether such a thing ever happened to the Gaon of Vilna, but the tradition percolates even about squashing it by way of forcing such a woman to marry to the other side, to the campaigner's side, to the anti-Hasidic side. It's not just the Hasidim who feel that this is devious, that this is dangerous.
But this is a tale, right? A legend?
It probably is a legend also, but it suggests that the same gut reaction to the phenomenon of a woman who is a virgin, a holy virgin, a woman who refuses to marry, who has religious experiences, people come to flock to her. So a Hasidic leadership and an anti-Hasidic leadership react in exactly the same way, which suggests to me it's a deeply sensed aversion to this phenomenon in rabbinic tradition. And I think I mentioned casually before that I have collected several other such stories. One of them, the earliest one, is in the Cairo Geniza, that is a collection of disused documents from Baghdad in the 11th century of a girl. Unfortunately, the document is broken. We don't have the end of the story, but we have enough. A girl, again, starts fasting, starts praying, refuses to marry, forced to marry, and in that case, as far as we can tell, abandons her husband, leaves her husband, and continues to go and preach and pray, and then the Sultan finds out, or the Caliph, sorry, it's not the Sultan there, it's a Caliph, finds out, and he says to chop off her head, and then we don't know what happened, because the page is torn. And there are some scattered, throughout the centuries from different places, stories that echo exactly the same sensibility. This is an illegitimate path. This is something that Judaism cannot tolerate. The only thing I need to say, and I haven't had time to say, but I'll just tell you briefly as we wind up, is that this was the situation in Hasidism, I believe, continuously until the interwar years. And even then, the change is, as far as I know, confined primarily to one Hasidic school only, and that's Jabad-Lubavitch. They are pioneers in that, and they're criticized. They're very controversial on other scores, but this is one of the things for which they're being criticized by other Hasidic groups and by Orthodox Jews in general. They begin, first of all, the earliest initiative I found is not yet bringing women in fully, but is the first stirring of defining the wives and the daughters of the Hasidim as a constituency. And that is already before the First World War, on the eve of the First World War, 1911 to 12, the wife of the then leader of Lubavitch, Shalom Dober, her name is Stern Sarah. She is the first kind of more modern Rebbetzin, the first. She decides to engage in philanthropy for the benefit of the Lubavitch community. Women, Jewish women, well-to-do Jewish women engaged in philanthropy is a phenomenon that begins in the West much earlier. You know, in the first half of the 19th century, we have Jewish women's philanthropic associations. In Eastern Europe, too, there were already outside of Hasidism quite a few that were operating. You know, the Jewish wealthy bourgeoisie was imitating what the non-Jewish bourgeoisie was doing, but in Hasidism, nothing of the sort. And Stern Sarah sends a letter, an appeal, to all the women in the Chabad community. It's the first time that all the women in the Lubavitch community were defined as a constituency, wherever they are. And by this time, by 1911-12, they are very dispersed, not just in their native region, which is the northeastern provinces of the Russian, of the Jewish Pale of Settlement, which is, nowadays it's Belarus and Lithuania, but they are scattered everywhere. They are in Leningrad, they are in, not yet Leningrad, in Petrograd, they are in America, they are in Carlsbad, you know, outside the Russian Empire, and everywhere within the Russia. They're in the Crimea, you know, they're very scattered. She sends this appeal, and she gets money. And she then, in 1912, publishes the list of 179 women, how much money they gave, and what the money was used for. Basically, the money was used for the yeshiva, which her husband, a pioneer himself, established the first Hasidic yeshiva. Hasidism didn't have yeshivas of its own. Yeshivas developed in the anti-Hasidic camp, but not in the Hasidic camp. He, in 1797, opened a yeshiva for Hasidim in Lubavitch, and this was to raise money to support the students in the yeshiva. So that was the first time that they were perceived as a constituency, as a female constituency. Her husband, however, was very anti-women. Her husband used the money to support the male students in the yeshiva, and used in his correspondence, he often accuses women of introducing secularism to the house, of being responsible for the decline of faith, because women who had no Jewish education by that time would have had to, they would have spoken Russian, they would have read other European languages, those who were educated. They wanted their children to be educated in a civilized European way. So he shakes the finger, he uses very strong language, Talmudic language, invoking Eve and the serpent. You know, there is a Midrashic tradition, a late Midrashic tradition about how, it's also available in the Christian tradition about the original sin. You know, the serpent, the snake of the story of Genesis, seduced Eve, is taken to be, he had sexual intercourse with her. So he uses the language of that, you know, he cast his filth, he cast his semen on her, is what the Midrash says. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe of the time says that the snake had cast its filth on all the women who are bringing in non-religious teachers to teach their children mathematics and other kind of European education skills, and causing, because by this stage, by the beginning of the 20th century, the Orthodox world generally, not just the Hasidic world, was in crisis. They were really panicking because the young people were leaving them in droves. They were seduced by Zionism, by socialism, revolutionary socialism of any kind, by just education, universities. They were going to universities, and they were very threatened. So he uses very aggressive language, and he says it's all the women's fault. But his successor, his son, is the first one who actually thinks that the real answer to the problem of the women introducing filth into the homes is to mobilize the women. And he begins for the first time to address the women himself. Nowhere ever do we have a trace of evidence of a Hasidic Rebbe addressing a constituency of women. And he does, and he begins by, first of all, mobilizing them simply for tasks of disseminating halachic knowledge, amongst the women in the families where they were already beginning to forget or to abandon, particularly ritual bathing for the women after menstruation. Eventually, in the 1930s, he even begins to advocate teaching the women who want to some of the mystical teachings of Hasidism. This is really radical, revolutionary, unheard of. And there are small groups of women who are doing it, and he calls them the brothers and the sisters of the students of the yeshiva, and establishes perfect symmetry between them. And this then dies out the whole of his experiment in the Holocaust, and with his own flight to America in 1940, it stops. But his successor, the last Lubavitch Rebbe, takes this on board fully. And whereas this man who started it, the pioneer, the real pioneer, this is the penultimate Lubavitch Rebbe, addresses his female constituency as the wives and daughters of the Hasidim. This is a term, time and again, wives and daughters of the Hasidim. I have this and this and this and this to tell you. I invite you to do this and this. His successor, one of the first things he does is so interesting. He creates the association of, and he calls it not the wives and daughters of the Hasidim, because that expression still suggests an indirect connection. You are affiliated with Lubavitch Hasidism by virtue of being married to a Hasid or being the daughter of a Hasid. He calls it the women and the girls of Chabad. You know, this is a direct affiliation, so they are now part of the constituency. And this is very novel, and he has actually created a new type of woman who is fully conscious of being a follower of the Rebbe.
Which year is that?
And this, he does that, the last Rebbe dies in 1950, and he succeeds the following year.
The last?
The one before, the one before, sorry. And he succeeds him within the year. It takes a little time, but he is established. And then one of the first things he does, 1952, is to establish this association of women and girls of Chabad, which functions to this day. It's got huge numbers of women emissaries who disseminate the word. They're missionaries, like the men, spreading the words of the Rebbe. And this is unheard of historically, and as I said, it's controversial. I'm sorry I've taken all this time, and but I would love to hear if you have any comments or questions in the time that we have before we go for falafel. Any responses? Yes, Javier, please.
I have comments.
Yeah.
One is an anecdote, and the second one is a question.
Yeah.
Or another comment from Sirius. The first one is the anecdote. Last year, we had here Vichy Cohen talking about images of rabbis and visual culture and modern
Yes, he was a
modern
pioneer of
culture.
that. Yeah.
So one of the slides he showed was a composite of faces of many rabbis. I don't know the chronology, maybe it was already 20th century. So it was the great men of Judaism.
Yes.
And among them there were, of course, Spinoza
Yeah.
and Mendes.
Yes.
They were quite problematic.
Yes.
But there was a woman.
A woman.
The woman, he says that woman is the maiden of Ludmer.
Wonderful.
But when I saw the image, I thought, no, this is not the maiden of Ludmer. This is Regina Jonas.
Who was a rabbi, of course.
And we checked on the internet, because I knew I have a picture of Regina in my
Yes,
office. Because she was
yes.
the first German
Which
female
makes much
rabbi.
better sense, yeah, of course, yeah.
And I just took a look on the internet.
And it is her.
Of course, you will go to the Wikipedia and you have Regina Jonas with
The same
form of
picture.
rabbi. But if you also write the maiden of Ludwig,
You get the same
you
picture.
Wow! Jean of Arc and everybody can join.
How wonderful.
And,
You know-
and the identification to, I think that was one of Witch's children, who said, no, this is the maiden of Ludwig, because we were discussing this, and it was him, the child, the son who passed to his father
This
the
identification.
the
Yeah, the-
big image of all these
Rabbis,
rabbis
really?
and great children of Israel,
How interesting.
figures of Israel. So that's
Thank you for
You
this.
have to
I've
speak
never
to
talked to
Richie.
Richie about
So
this.
I
Yeah.
wonder if there would be any connection between both women, because when I saw also the image, I thought, no, I mean, even the fashion of how she's
Of
dressed
course, it's implausible.
would be
Yeah.
mid-19th century.
Yeah, and it wouldn't be the clothes of a Hasidic leader, even if she was male. I mean, they wouldn't wear the same kind of clothes as a... No, I mean, this is really interesting. It is a measure of how popular in the contemporary Israeli imagination the Maid of Ludmir is, because of course Orthodox women who are now feminists and who are fighting for equality have embraced her as an icon. I mean, they've even,
I mean, this is the image of
this is Regina Jonas.
Regina
Yeah.
Jonas. She's also identified as the Maiden of Ludmir.
Yes, it's funny. I must talk to Richie about this. So thank you so much, Javier. You know, they've even, for the Maid of Ludmir, which is why the son would have known about it, there was a play in the Khan in Jerusalem, the Maid of Ludmir, and there's a group of feminists, there's a woman called Yael Levin, who is an Orthodox feminist, who has championed the attempt to locate the tomb of the Maid of Ludmir in Mount Olive in Jerusalem, and there's no trace of it. But she believes that there is, and they went to the Chevra Kadisha and they managed to get their support. So now there is a site. There's also a yard site. They know exactly the date. It's completely fantastical. And there have been several pilgrimages on the yard site, on the Memorial Day, to the tomb site. And they have a service, and they published articles about it in the press. She's very important now as an icon for authentic kind of female leadership, Hasidic, rabbinic, it doesn't matter to them, you know, but it is a woman who has managed to distinguish herself. This is wonderful. I'm sure that's how the son knew about the Maid of Ludmir. He would never have heard of her if not for this latest cult of the Maid of Ludmir.
And is there any article about this new happening about her?
I have a few references here, and there's probably more. I mean, this dates, I mean, I've updated it as far as I could, but there's probably more. I'm not entirely aware.
And the other common question is concerning virgins as prophetesses.
Yeah.
We were talking about this negative approach to
Yes.
rabbis. And I was immediately thinking about all these Spanish Castilian prophetesses of the
Yes.
late 15th and early 16th
Yes.
century. All of them are
Nuns.
described as virgins.
Yeah, virgins and nuns, yeah.
And I mean, we don't know what would have been the approach by rabbis, because there were already no rabbis in
Yes.
the Iberian Peninsula by around 1500. But is there any, or are you aware of any positive approach by rabbis to
Absolutely
that
not.
figure?
The opposite. Of these particular
Oh,
figures.
no. Okay, virgins. The question of virgins as a positive feature
No,
for
absolutely not.
prophetess.
I mean,
Because
that's
think-
to me the very striking thing. That absolutely not. I mean, I have never seen a positive evaluation of a woman as a virgin in any other terms but the fact that she is pure until her marriage. You know, we managed to keep her from straying from the right path. But not any attribution of power to although I did see some very little, and I don't know how to take them, references to the value of virginity in men. And one, I think I mentioned here in my first session, I think, a comment by Nachmanides on a particular verse in Deuteronomy, which is interpreted as applying to, a particular verse in the Song of Songs, which is applied to Bachurei Israel, brought together with the verse in Deuteronomy, to suggest that Bachurei Israel, the elect ones, the young men of Israel, who shelo yad'u ta'am chet, who have never tasted sin, And Nachmanides explains, what does it mean we've never tasted sin, we've never known a woman. So this is a positive view of virginity in men. And I think at the same time I also mentioned this one document, this mysterious document that we have an English translation of in Judaism in Practice by Kanafogel, this Chukei HaTorah, the laws of the Torah, which appear to speak about families dedicating one son to a life of study, which is completely protected from any contact with the outside world, and includes not marriage. And where the teacher is a proper rabbi who is married and has a family, and he goes every weekend to have sex with his wife, but then every week when he comes back to the place, to this yeshiva, to this place where it's almost like this monastery that they go to, he has to purify himself, he has to wash, he has to change his clothes and purify himself of the sex that he had had with his wife when he goes to instruct these young men. So there is clearly, whether these men are destined eventually to marry, we don't know, because the document doesn't tell us whether this is lifelong or whether, but it seems to be a matter for years. They have to, and the model is Samuel. You remember from the book of Samuel, whose mother, Hannah, after she prays for a child, is given this child and she dedicates him to the temple service. So he's not married and he's taken into the temple service. I mean, the Hebrew Bible is innocent of all these sensibilities about virginity and so on. It simply doesn't tell us that Samuel ever married, but maybe there's a lost chapter in Samuel that tells us he was. It's not inconceivable. But from the story as it stands, he is dedicated to temple service without marriage, because priests were allowed to marry, even the high priests were married. But in that story, he is portrayed as a man dedicated, and never again is he ever mentioned as married, so he is assumed to have been a celibate. So there's a certain measure of evaluation of the virginal state in a man who is not being polluted by, rather like as in a Christian, but never for a woman. I mean, for a woman not to be polluted by sex is for her to be completely against her nature, to go against what she is there for, basically.
So that would put a question question mark on the no?
On the
Judaism of these virgins.
Absolutely. I'm sure that they may well have maintained an allegiance to Judaism, but they must have completely internalized, and with good reason. I mean, the rabbis are clever, and they recognize that there is a certain built-in incompatibility between a life in the world, a life with family and children, and the life of pure scholarship. They recognize that there is a positive spiritual energy that is released when you are completely blocking the other pole. And I'm sure these women benefited from this, so the Christian life that they had become a part of enabled them to live in an environment in which they could be educated, in which they could write, and in which they could have mystical experiences. So I don't think that it would put in question such allegiance with Judaism or such residual Judaism as they had, because whatever happens in their head is a different matter. But in terms of the way of life that they usually seem to have gone for, this was ideal. It's something that if we had it in Judaism, we would have had a lot more texts written by women, a lot of mystical saints, who are female. We would have had precisely what we so uniquely do not have. And I think that's why we don't have it. So I'm all in favor of celibacy and asceticism and so on. I think I mentioned, or did I not mention, that I was also aware, when I began to think about these things in the 80s, I was very aware that the books that were available at that time, scholarly books, about Jewish sexual practices, Jewish marriage, and they're called all kinds of things. There's a whole library of them. Most of them that were written in the 60s or 50s, particularly in the 60s, are very self-congratulatory, because they're very much in tune with the sexual liberation of the period. So they're very pleased to emphasize how Judaism is positive about sex and about, not just procreation, but sex and so on. Judah Golding wrote one book, a conservative rabbi. I remember thinking that they are riding on a wave of the kind of the embracing of sexuality that was characteristic of the period. By the 80s, when I became interested in it myself, there was the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. And suddenly, celibacy became chic. And I have a small collection of books on my shelves by various people, journalists, one scholar, who are actually advocating a return to celibacy as a productive way of life, a healthy way of life. It was you can see how the way we develop our ideas ultimately is shaped by the kind of social reality in which we operate. And now, of course, now there's still groups of girls in American schools, teenagers, who wear this kind of special ring that suggests that they're not going to go into sex, even though there's immense social pressure on teenagers to do it. And at the same time, a great deal of promiscuity as well, amongst youngsters. But the kind of celibacy is chic has not died down since then, Any other thoughts or questions?
I would like to know a reference. Like when you were speaking of the tales of Prof, and you spoke about the list or evidence of books that they were reading. Did I understand well in Yiddish or in Hebrew?
That
we
the women that were
yeah.
Yiddish, it was the classic Yiddish, what the Hasidic women were reading, mind you, again, this is evidence from silence. I haven't managed to come across.
This is it. Where is the evidence from? This is my question.
Well, there's no, the evidence comes from incidental remarks, and again, I've got footnotes there, of people describing people from Hasidic households describing what the women are doing on Shabbat. They don't often describe it, but there are, I have a handful of references which surprised me, because what they were reading was Shenis Soil, Kava Yosher, I can't even say it in the Ashkenazi way properly, but these are books that women who are not Hasidic were reading.
But is there a list of books?
Yeah, occasionally yes. We have I have one case where Lubavitch, the penultimate Lubavitch Rebbe, describes what his grandmother, who is a very important figure for him, Rivka, what she used to do on the afternoon, because she was one of these women who were credited with a lot of power in the court and so on, that she used to gather the women of the household in her apartment in the compound of the court, and she would read to them. And then he says what she would read to them, and this is the list. I have another one. I remember at the time when I was asking myself these questions, I wrote to Iris Porush. I don't know if you know Iris Porush. This is an Israeli scholar. She's professor at Ben-Gurion University, who wrote a book. She's since written another one, but the first kind of book that made her name was an attempt to reconstruct the reading habits of Eastern European Jewish women in the 19th century. And what she comes up with is that the women were reading Russian or Polish or French or much more than they were, and if they were reading anything else, and they were not doing much of it, was Yiddish, but very few of them were actually interested in reading Hebrew and educated themselves. So, given that she had gone through this literature, I wrote to her and I said, have you ever come across, have you got any information? So she sent me to one reference. I still remember, it was a man called Baruch Levin, a man who wrote in the 50s his book of memoirs about his upbringing in a Hasidic environment in the south of the Ukraine, where there were already at that time, in the 1860s and 70s, where there were agricultural colonies that were initiated by the Russian government and were approved of by the Hasidic leaders at the time. They were, thinking that they would go along with the Tsarist regime, which tried to normalize the Jews to bring them back to the land, and it kind of coincided with their own aspirations for solving the terrible economic problems of the constituents. So he was brought up in this colony, they're called Moshavot, and he says that one day a Hasidic Rebbe came to town, and the whole town, and they were not all Hasidim, I don't know, but they all went to listen to him when he spoke. And then there was one woman in the town who was a midwife, and she was quite educated, and she was reading Shifrei Habesh, she doesn't say in what language, I presume in Yiddish, together with, and then he gives a list of all these other works which are the standard repertoire in Yiddish. And so that's the single. She sent me the reference and I found it, and so Shifrei Habesh was mentioned there. But I was a little bit suspicious of this reference because the repertoire that he does cite, and it consists of about 5 or 6 books, was indeed the classic standard repertoire, and he concludes it with v'chule, etc. So it had a bit of a look of what a man might imagine the women are reading, rather than actually based on what he observed this woman midwife reading. I'm not sure I can trust it. And so far, it's my only reference. I mean, my search for more evidence still ongoing, and Iris knows that I'm looking out for it, but she's now doing some other things. So again, it's evidence from silence, from the failure to. So it's not inconceivable that they did read it, but I don't have any evidence to say that they did.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all. It was really nice. I enjoyed it very much, and I hope you did too. And whatever it was nice to get together once or twice a week and to learn something about you all. This was new territory for me. I've never been here, and I'm certainly not in this situation. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity. It was a real pleasure. It was nice, and it was nice to see some old friends.